She's ranked 20th. She just got signed before her biggest tournament. Nobody can explain why until you see the data. A hotel company just did something that breaks every rule of sports marketing, and almost nobody has noticed. Here's a sentence that should not make sense. 10 days before the biggest tournament of her career, a 21-year-old tennis player ranked 20th in the world got signed by one of the largest hotel companies on earth. And the deal has almost nothing to do with tennis. Stay with me because by the end of this video you are going to look at sports sponsorships completely differently. You're going to understand why a massive company would deliberately sign an athlete before her moment of maximum hype instead of after. You're going to see the exact data point that explains a decision worth, by some unconfirmed estimates, tens of millions of dollars. And you're going to find out why this company picked one specific country to leave out of the deal on purpose, and what that omission tells us about where the entire sponsorship industry is heading next. If you like stories where a small, overlooked detail unlocks a much bigger picture, this channel is built for exactly that. Hit subscribe now because we are about to take apart a press release line by line, and what's hiding underneath it is stranger than the headlines let on. Let's start with the two rooms this story lives in, because the contrast matters. It's the middle of August 2026. In New York, the grounds at Flushing Meadows are being built out for the US Open. Sponsor tents going up, hospitality suites being wired, the whole machine of the year's last Grand Slam grinding into motion. Thousands of miles away, in Melbourne, it's the dead of the Australian winter. Rod Laver Arena sits dark and empty. The next Australian Open isn't for another 5 months. Between those two cities, one tournament that hasn't started yet, one that's a full season away. Marriott's Asia-Pacific office puts out a press release. It's short. It doesn't lead with a number. It doesn't announce a contract length. It says one thing, clearly: Filipino tennis player Alex Eala is now the face of Marriott Bonvoy's Tennis the World campaign for Asia-Pacific, excluding China, 10 days before the US Open, not after. And that timing is the detail that should stop you in your tracks, because the entire sponsorship industry is built on the opposite instinct. Normally, brands wait. They watch the tournament, they watch the trophy get lifted, and then they open the checkbook when the highlight reel is already cut and the athlete's value is easy to point to. Marriott didn't do that. And when a company that operates roughly 9,000 properties across the globe moves early on a 21-year-old who, 10 days earlier, had just lost in the third round of a tournament in Toronto, the interesting question isn't how much did she get paid. The interesting question is, what did Marriott see that the rest of the market hadn't priced in yet? That's what this video is actually about. Not the deal. The timing of the deal. Who is Alex Eala? And why is everyone suddenly talking about her? If you're new to her story, here's the fast version. And I promise every number here is one I've checked. Alex Eala is a 21-year-old professional tennis player from Quezon City in the Philippines. She turned professional in March 2020 and spent her development years training at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain. 4 years she was a talented, well-regarded player with a devoted but modest following. Someone tennis insiders knew, but casual fans didn't. Then, in the span of about 6 weeks in the middle of 2026, 3 things happened that changed her entire category. At Wimbledon, in the third round, she beat the defending champion, Iga Swiatek, in straight sets on center court, 7-6, 6-2. That is the kind of result that a tournament does not forget. Eala went on to reach the fourth round before losing to Jasmine Paolini, the deepest she'd ever gone at a Grand Slam. Then, at the Mubadala DC Open in Washington at the end of July and start of August, she put together the most disruptive week of her career, beating Jessica Pegula, Elena Svitolina, and Naomi Osaka on her way to a rain-delayed final, where she beat Pegula 4-6, 6-4, 6-0 to win her first-ever WTA singles title. It was the first WTA singles title ever won by a Filipino player on either the men's or women's tour on August 3, 2026. The day after that trophy lift, the WTA rankings updated. She stood at world number 20, a career high, and the highest ranking any Filipino player has ever held in tour history. That's the woman Marriott signed roughly a week later. Paradox 1. Wrong direction on the calendar. If Marriott wanted a US Open bounce, If the entire point of this signing was to ride whatever Eala was about to do at Flushing Meadows, the calendar makes no sense. You don't announce your new ambassador 10 days before her Grand Slam. You announce her during the tournament or after it, once the highlight package is already cut and the brand can attach itself to a result that's already locked in. Every advertising executive who has ever built a media plan around a live sporting event knows this rule. It's basic. Marriott did the opposite. They signed her with her most recent result being a straight sets loss in the third round of the National Bank Open in Toronto. A defeat to Belinda Bencic, 4-6, 0-6. Not a career-best moment. A loss. Hold that detail because it matters more later. For now, just sit with the paradox. Marriott moved before the tournament that would have made the signing look obviously smart, not after. That's a choice. What were they seeing that made the timing not matter? Paradox 2. The wrong tournament on purpose. The campaign she's the face of is called Tennis the World. And the anchor of that campaign isn't the US Open. It isn't Wimbledon. It isn't Roland Garros. It's the Australian Open, where Marriott Bonvoy has been the official hotel partner for years, and where the 2027 edition runs January 11th through the 31st, 5 months away. The press release makes this explicit. The actual member benefit tied to the Eala partnership is early access to Australian Open 2027 tickets. That's the deliverable. So the world's number 20 women's player, at the exact peak of her US Open media cycle, has been signed to promote a tournament happening on the other side of the planet months in the future. Why anchor a red-hot, right now athlete to an event that isn't happening for 5 months? Hold that question too. Paradox 3. The missing market. Here's the one that jumps out the moment you actually read the fine print. Marriott didn't sign Eala for Asia-Pacific. They signed her for Asia-Pacific, excluding China. It's not a footnote. It's in the headline of the campaign itself. Think about that exclusion for a second. China is, by almost any measure, the single biggest tennis market in Asia, the largest tournament calendar, the biggest broadcast audience, an entire late-season WTA swing built around Chinese cities. If you were building a tennis ambassador deal for the Asia-Pacific region, the obvious move is to include China. Marriott drew a line around it instead: Southeast Asia, South Asia, Australia, Japan, Korea, and said, this is her territory and China is not part of it. Why would you deliberately carve the largest market in the region out of your regional ambassador deal? Hold that one too. We're about to answer all three. Paradox 4, the quietest one and the loudest one. This is the detail that's easy to miss, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Marriott's actual announcement. Not the aggregator posts. Not the recirculated screenshots. The actual press release and the actual quote from Marriott's own chief commercial officer contains no dollar figure and no personal perk for Eala. You've probably seen numbers floating around online. Big ones. I want to be straightforward with you. I went looking for where those figures actually originated, and I could not find them in Marriott's press release, in any of the trade coverage of the deal, or on Marriott's own campaign page. As of today, no verified contract value for this deal has been published anywhere. If someone hands you a specific number with total confidence, they're guessing, and you should treat it that way. What is explicitly stated in the release is a benefit, but it's not a benefit to Eala. It's a benefit to Marriott Bonvoy members, early access to Australian Open tickets, and access to branded fan experiences. Read that again. The deal, as Marriott themselves describe it, isn't structured around the athlete. It's structured around the loyalty program. So why would Marriott want their members near Eala, rather than promoting Eala herself as the prize? The reframe. Here's where the assumption most people are carrying quietly breaks. You've probably been assuming this whole time that Marriott signed Alex Eala because she is a rising tennis player. That's the default script. It's how every sponsorship story gets told. Player gets famous, brand shows up, brand pays player to wear the logo. The deal exists to attach the brand to the athlete. That is not what happened here. Marriott didn't sign Alex Eala because she's a tennis player who's suddenly good. Marriott signed Alex Eala because she is the most credible entry point they currently have into a region they have already, publicly, identified as the growth engine of their entire loyalty business. The tennis isn't the point. The tennis is the delivery mechanism. The actual product being sold here is Marriott Bonvoy membership across Southeast Asia and the wider Asia-Pacific region. To a customer base Marriott's own research says is loyalty hungry, travel hungry, and currently up for grabs. That's why they moved before the US Open. They weren't trying to catch a wave. They were making a long-term regional bet that doesn't depend on one tournament's outcome. That's why the campaign is anchored to Melbourne, not New York, because the Australian Open is the closest Grand Slam to Southeast Asia, geographically and culturally. That's why China is carved out, because Marriott's own regional research and reporting explicitly defines Asia-Pacific excluding China as its own strategic market, separate from China, which Marriott and most hospitality groups treat as a distinct business unit with different dynamics entirely. And that's why the headline benefit in the release is for members, not for her, because she isn't the audience of this deal. The Marriott Bonvoy member is the audience. Eala is the face they chose to speak to that audience with. Once you see it that way, all four paradoxes stop being strange and start being a strategy. Proof 1, the timing itself. Most sponsorship coverage flattens athletes into billboards. Deal announced, number gets quoted, everyone moves on. What's interesting about the Eala deal is that its timing deliberately breaks from a pattern the tennis industry has been quietly nervous about for years. In September 2021, Emma Raducanu won the US Open as a qualifier, a genuinely unprecedented run. In the weeks that followed, she signed roughly a dozen major sponsorships in a rush, at what analysts have since described as inflated post-slam pricing. Tennis trade press has spent years picking over that period, and the general critique isn't that she signed too many deals. It's that they were priced off a single tournament result, which made some of those partnerships hard to sustain once her ranking became less consistent. In fact, when covering the Eala Marriott deal, tennis outlets explicitly drew this comparison, describing it as carrying echoes of the Raducanu sponsorship rush, while noting Marriott had done the opposite by moving early rather than waiting. Marriott signed Eala at world number 20, coming off a loss 10 days before her US Open, not after a signature win. You cannot fake that decision. It's on the calendar. It reads like a company that studied the Raducanu case and deliberately chose the other side of the trade. Sign the market bet, not the momentum spike. Proof 2, what the executive actually said. If you read enough corporate sponsorship announcements, and I have more than is probably healthy, you learn to listen for what the executive says the athlete represents, because that's the part that isn't just marketing copy. That's the part that tells you the actual strategy. Marriott's chief commercial officer for the region, John Toomey, is quoted describing Eala as authentic and inspiring. And this is the specific phrase, proudly connected to the region we serve. Read that sentence again. It's not future Grand Slam champion. It's not language about tennis achievement at all. The operative idea is about the region, about her connection to the region Marriott serves. That is not accidental phrasing. Executives at that level do not describe a multi-year regional ambassador deal in loose language. Toomey is telling anyone paying attention exactly why she was signed. The tennis is the entry point, the region is the point. Proof 3. The data that makes it all click. This is where the case stops being a theory and becomes something you can actually verify yourself. Back in May 2026, months before the Eala deal, Marriott Bonvoy published its Loyalty Trends Report 2026, based on a survey of 1,731 travelers across Australia, India, Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam, conducted with Cantor. The finding, 89% of travelers across Asia-Pacific, excluding China, that exact regional definition, already participate in at least one loyalty program. That's not a region where loyalty programs are being introduced for the first time. That's a region where loyalty is already close to saturated, and where the fight isn't, does the market use loyalty programs? It's whose loyalty program wins the emotional attachment of the traveler. Marriott's own report also found food and travel experiences, not price alone, are now the strongest predictor of which program a traveler stays loyal to, which is precisely the kind of experiential hook a global athlete ambassador is built to deliver. Marriott published this data in its own name, about the exact region it later signed Eala to represent months before the deal. Put the pieces together. Sign before the price resets around a single tournament. Sign for the exact region your own research says is the battleground. Sign a face who is explicitly, publicly connected to Southeast Asia, a Filipino athlete from the middle of that map. Anchor the campaign to the Grand Slam closest to that region by flight time and time zone. And structure the deal so the headline deliverable, Australian Open 2027 ticket access, is something a member gets, not something Eala gets. Every time a fan in the region wants to see her at the tournament nearest to them, the funnel points towards signing up for Marriott Bonvoy. That's not really a sponsorship in the traditional sense. That's a customer acquisition funnel with a tennis player standing at the top of it. The honest limits because you deserve them. I don't want to leave you with a story that's cleaner than it actually is. So here's what this reframe does not prove. It doesn't prove Marriott had some kind of foresight about exactly how her US Open would go. As I'm putting this together, her main draw hasn't even started. The tournament begins August 30th, and Eala is set to enter it as the highest-seeded Filipino player ever to compete in a Grand Slam. After a summer that also included a third-round run at the Cincinnati Open, where she pushed world number 10 Amanda Anisimova to 3 sets before losing. If Marriott had waited 2 more weeks to sign her, they'd very likely have signed her at close to the same market value. The strength of the timing isn't that Marriott predicted a specific result. It's that they built a deal that doesn't depend on one. That's a subtle distinction, and it's worth naming clearly, because it's the opposite of gambling on a highlight reel. It also doesn't prove she'll hold on to number 20. Rankings move, and tennis is unforgiving on 21-year-olds carrying the weight of an entire country's expectations. The loss to Bensic in Toronto was real. The loss to Anisimova in Cincinnati was real. There will be more results like that this fall. That's just how the tour works for every player climbing this fast. And finally, I want to be completely honest about something I mentioned earlier. Nobody outside Marriott and Eala's team actually knows what this deal is worth in dollars. The specific figures you may have seen circulating are not confirmed by any primary source I could find. The real story here was never really about the number. It's about the timing, the region, the deliberate exclusion of China, and the fact that the headline benefit belongs to Marriott's members rather than to the athlete herself. When a verified number eventually surfaces, it will likely end up being a footnote to a much bigger story. Where this leaves us. So here's the picture we're actually left with. Alex Eala isn't standing in a trophy room right now. She's standing in a conference room, metaphorically, at least the kind of room where a chief commercial officer overseeing thousands of hotel properties looks at market research for a region of hundreds of millions of travelers, looks at a 21-year-old Filipino tennis player at world number 20, and decides those two things belong on the same slide. Marriott put her there first. And when a company operating at that scale identifies one athlete as its entry point into its most important growth region, other companies in adjacent categories notice: airlines, fashion houses, financial services, consumer electronics. That's not hypothetical. It's exactly the pattern that's played out before, with other athletes whose commercial ceiling ended up matching as much as their athletic one. Marriott moving early on Eala is, in effect, a signal to the rest of that market that she has now been priced. Whatever brand signs her next will be negotiating in the shadow of this deal. The one after that will be shaped by both. So the next time you see her name attached to another ambassador deal, remember that the shape of it was set back in August 2026, when a hotel company looked at a 21-year-old ranked 20th in the world, 10 days before her biggest tournament, and decided not to wait. If this changed the way you're thinking about how these deals actually get made, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want to be here for whichever brand signs her next, because at this rate it's not a question of if, subscribe now. We'll be covering it here first.